Chapter 6. Jeremiah Holt. Later that afternoon, Isaac travelled across the city to meet Joshua Marks, his lawyer. Hennessy Street was a narrow, cobbled lane lined with Victorian brick buildings with steep pitched roofs and little Gothic arches over the entrances. Mature maple trees grew as tall as the buildings and left the road in shadow. The morning fog still lingered here, caught in the eaves and trapped in the alleyways. Isaac pushed his way through a shroud of mist that lurked in the entrance to number 598 and entered the current location of the law firm of Jeremiah Holt. He was met by an elderly clerk dressed in a dark suit and crisp white shirt with a narrow, deep red tie, who looked at him over the top of pince nez perched on the end of his nose. He nodded when Isaac introduced himself. He led Isaac up a creaking, well-polished staircase to the lawyer's office. The clerk knocked and entered. "Detective Goldstein to see you, Mr. Holt." Isaac stepped through the door and found Jeremiah Holt sitting behind a large wooden desk, lit by a banker's lamp, the only illumination in the office. There was an antique feel to the room. 12-foot-high ceilings, wood-panelled walls, and bookshelves packed with red leather-bound books. A Queen Anne chair stood in the corner, where Isaac imagined himself falling asleep, warm and safe, listening to rain patter on the window. The lawyer rose and extended his hand. Holt was a thin, middle-aged man. His face was long and full of edges. His suit was elegantly cut. A gold watch chain hung out of a small pocket of a smart vest. He shook Isaac's hand firmly. "Pleased to meet you, Detective Goldstein," he said, his voice steady, reassuring, precise. "How can I be of service to you today?" "I want to talk with you about a client of yours." "Well, I will endeavour to do my best. Please take a seat." There were two comfortable-looking chairs before the lawyer's desk, each padded in red velvet. They sat down. Isaac pulled out his ink pen and notebook. It brought the attention of the ever-observant Mr. Holt. "Well, Detective Goldstein, you're a man after my own heart. I've always been a pen and ink man myself," he said, indicating with his hand an old-fashioned inkwell that stood on his desk. "I find my mind works better if I have a physical connection with the words," said Isaac. "True, Detective, so true." Holt put his elbows on the arms of his chair and brought his hands together, his fingertips touching as he breathed in deeply. "Now, which client is it that you wish to talk with me about?" "His name was Joshua Marks." "The name rings a bell, but I can't remember seeing him recently. I take it Mr. Marks is dead." "He was found this morning." "I'm presuming, by the presence of a detective in my office, that his death was suspicious." "Well, let's just say there are certain elements to his death that are unusual." "I see," said Mr. Holt, pressing the button on his intercom. "Sir?" "Elliot, I need the file for a Joshua Marks." "Yes, sir." The lawyer let go of the button on the intercom and turned back to Isaac. "Would you like some coffee?" Isaac nodded again. "Please." Holt rose from his desk and left the office, stepping down to a little kitchenette from where Isaac smelt the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Isaac noticed there was music playing in the room. It wasn't very loud, barely audible, but Isaac guessed when Holt was alone he would be able to hear it easily. He cocked his ear, trying to identify the piece. Mr. Holt came back and noticed. "It's Ravel, the Adagio from his piano concerto," he said, and set down 2 cups of coffee. "It's quite an idyllic piece, isn't it? Reflective." There was a knock on the door, and Elliot answered and handed a file to his boss. The lawyer opened the file and perused its contents for a minute or two. "Ah, yes. Now I remember him. Quite a pleasant man, as I recall. A little eccentric, but aren't we all to some degree? Josh remarked, yes. Quite an interesting fellow. Can you tell me what the nature of your business was with Mr. Marks? Indeed I can. He came to me to make a will. Is that so? I wasn't sure if he had any next of kin. That's one of the reasons I came to see you. Did he have much to leave them? He didn't seem to be too well off. Yes, I can see how you would think that. Joshua didn't care too much for appearances, but he was far from poor, and he did have family. So who is his next of kin? Joshua's older brother, Obadiah. Do you have an address for him? Jeremiah Holt passed Isaac the information. He could see that Holt had recorded everything down with pen and ink. The flowing handwritten spread across the page in a majestic italic script. Now you said family. Yes, there is one other, a niece, the daughter of Joshua and Obadiah's younger half-sister by their father's second marriage. Does she stand to gain by the will? Yes, she does. Is there anybody else mentioned? No, only the two are mentioned. The half-sister and the rest of the family died some years ago, I believe. Can you give me the address of the niece? I can give you her name. It is Ruth Marks. But as to her address, I'm afraid not. Even Joshua was unaware of it. The name registered with Isaac, the last entry in Joshua's notebook. So it's possible she may be dead too. I suppose so, but she is considerably younger than her uncles. I would be obliged, Detective, if you kept me informed as to your inquiries concerning her. I would not like to disclose the will without her present. Don't worry, Mr. Holt. I will inform both of them to get in touch with you, and if I do find the niece is no longer with us, I will let you know. Much obliged, sir. There's just one more thing. You said Joshua was actually far from poor. That is correct. The largesse of the will is not insignificant. Can you tell me how much? Something in the region of $10 million? With thoughts of the case running through his head, Isaac left the lawyer's office and walked back down Hennessy Street to his car. Just down from Mr. Holt's office was a grim-looking red-brick building. Isaac recognized it as a synagogue, closed down now. He paused and stepped into the little yard in front of the building. His father's synagogue was still operating, but the size of the congregation had declined. Those who remained were mostly old. The young were not interested. Some no longer believed in God, and many didn't believe enough to go regularly to the synagogue. Isaac had not attended for several years, a fact that his father never brought up, but now, with his death, left Isaac wondering if he had, would it have made a difference? Isaac imagined how his father must have felt, how the passion and purpose of a life can fade. How hard that must have been for his father, who began to question the very existence of the God he proclaimed to worship. Did he imagine himself a fake, his life led for nothing? What about me? What did I believe? It was the thought that ran unanswered in Isaac's head, the thought he avoided. Not so much his belief in God, but in what he saw as his purpose, his passion in his own life. Had it faded? Chapter 7. La cour est ces raisons que le raison ne connaît point. Blaise Pascal. The mansion of Obadiah Marks was surrounded by a high brick wall with broken glass embedded in the mortar around the top. The driveway was secured by a 10-foot iron gate. Isaac spoke into an intercom mounted on a concrete post. My name is Detective Goldstein of the Toronto Police Department. I'm here to see Obadiah Marks. And what is it in regard to? It's about his brother, Joshua. There was a pause, followed by a loud clunk as the gates opened. They closed behind him as he drove up to a turnaround in front of the house. The house looked newly constructed, built to replicate the French style from the 1700s. There were large windows with shutters folded back. A set of double doors opened before he reached them, and a man dressed in black met him. "This way, Detective Goldstein." Isaac was shown into what looked like the library. "Mr. Obadiah will be with you shortly." He left Isaac alone and closed the door. Isaac stepped over to the books and scanned the titles. There were novels by Tolkien, Frank Herbert, Dostoevsky, and Saul Bellow, but fiction was only a small part of the library. The majority of books were non-fiction, biographies on business moguls like Gates, Carnegie, and Roberts. There were several shelves of history books. Isaac pulled out an old copy of the history of the Jewish people during the Babylonian, Persian, and Greek periods, an early 20th century work by Charles Kent. There was an inscription in the front of the book: "To Joshua on his birthday, love from mother." "The history books belong to my brother." Isaac was startled by the deep, growly voice. He looked up and saw a man standing just inside the door. He was tall, although his height was somewhat reduced by a stoop. His hair was thin, and Isaac could see age spots on the top of his head. Bony fingers clutched tightly around a stick he used to walk across to an armchair, where he settled with an audible sigh. "You told my man you've news of my brother?" "Yes, sir," said Isaac. "Well, spit it out, man. I haven't got all day." "I'm afraid that your brother died last night." The old man did not react, except his eyes squinted at Isaac. "Is that so? Well, I'm not surprised. We're both old, but I always thought I'd be the first to go. I am older than my brother, you know, only by a year, but you get it into your head, being the older, that you'll be the first to go." "There are some questions I need to ask." "Questions?" growled Obadiah. "Yes, sir." "Well, I'm not speaking till I've had a drink." He took a remote out from his pocket and pressed it. A minute later, the man who showed Isaac into the library appeared at the door. "Get the girl to bring in some drinks. The usual for me. Detective?" "Nothing for me," said Isaac. "Nonsense. I won't hear of it. I can't drink alone. Don't trust a man who don't drink, my father used to say. Mind you, he drank like a fish. Never could abide teetotalers. Thought they had something to hide. You don't have anything to hide, do you, detective?" "I'll have a scotch." The old man smiled and nodded at the servant, who left the room. Obadiah mellowed at the promise of alcohol, and seeing Isaac look around, he said, "My brother and I grew up in this house." "Excuse me, Mr. Marks, but the house looks new." "Old house," said Obadiah. "Trouble with old houses, they begin to need repair. 10 years ago I had the whole place rebuilt around the old. From the outside it looks new, but it's a replica of what was here before. Kept many of the old features. This floor, for instance, is the original." The door opened, and a petite young woman brought in a tray with the drinks on it. She looked dangerously thin, and her eyes were like saucers in her pinched face. Obadiah snatched a drink from the tray, and the maid came over to Isaac and served him his scotch. "Thank you," said Isaac, and the maid seemed surprised by his politeness. She looked at him, brown, searching eyes. It was just a single second, yet Isaac felt suddenly short of breath. "Go!" barked Obadiah, and the young woman turned and left the room. Isaac took a few long breaths as the old man swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Obadiah lifted the tumbler to his lips and downed the spirit. He shook himself as the drink reached his stomach and gave the desired effect. He turned his attention back to Isaac. "Questions. You said you had questions," the man growled. "The circumstances of your brother's death aren't clear-cut," said Isaac. "What's that?" "Your brother died of heart failure, but we're not certain if that was brought on by the actions of another. When we found him, the house was on fire. The firefighters managed to douse the flames quickly and confirm the fire was deliberately set." "What house was this?" A house on Kenneth Street." "Ah, that one. It used to belong to my uncle, long time back. Tried to sell it a number of years ago, but no one wanted it. The place is worthless. Wrong area of the city now. Bloody dangerous. So that's where he was living. Was he there on his own? Yes. Bloody big place to be living by oneself. He was living in just 3 rooms at the back, an apartment separate from the rest of the house. That used to be the servants' quarters. What was he doing living there? That's what I thought you could tell me, sir. I've learned that it wasn't because of financial reasons. Certainly not. But I've no idea why he chose to be there. He was always a strange fellow. Often wondered if we had the same parents, know what I mean? So you think someone tried to burn down the house and give him a heart attack? Something like that. Well, I can't help you. My brother and I never kept in touch. The last time I saw or heard from him was about 6 years ago. He came here to tell me he'd written a will. Wanted to know if I'd seen our niece, the daughter of our half-sister. Lord knows why. But that's why he came here, asking if I'd heard from her. But I didn't know anything. Recently, I heard she was living in the shelter, working as a waitress in some goddamn place. Didn't know where Joshua was, so I brought her back, and she's been living here ever since. You just met her. Isaac realized that the woman who'd served the drinks was Ruth, the niece mentioned in the will. You mean to say that you have your niece working as your servant? Well, I'm not a bloody charity, and this is a lot better than where she'd been before. Isaac wasn't quite sure, but he felt angry. He felt Ruth's treatment was somehow personal to him. Is it possible for me to talk with her? Said Isaac. What? You think she had something to do with my brother's death? I wouldn't put it past her. I just want to ask her a few questions. Obadiah sighed loudly, gave Isaac a look of annoyance, before pulling out his remote and pushing the button. The man in the dark suit appeared. Send the girl back. The detective wants to talk to her. The man left the room. If that's all you need me for, I've things to do, said Obadiah, and left without waiting for Isaac to answer. A few minutes later the door opened, and Ruth Marks stepped quietly into the room. She stood there for a moment, waiting. Isaac looked at her. Her fine, brown hair was tied up tight behind her head. She wore a short, black linen dress, a pair of white tights and simple shoes. Isaac was overwhelmed by a sudden sense of sorrow, and the grief that he had felt in his heart these past few weeks suddenly threatened to overwhelm him. Instead, he said her name. Ruth? She looked up at him, and Isaac's feelings were joined by confusion. Have we met before, Ruth? She looked at him, and everything in her expression screamed yes. No, she said. For a few seconds, Isaac's mind was filled with a lifetime of memories, his memories that she had not been a part of, and yet nothing. Focus, Goldstein. He took a deep breath. My name is Detective Isaac Goldstein. Won't you come and sit down? Ruth stepped forward and perched on the very edge of the chair, resting her hands on her lap. She was all skin and bones. She can't have been more than 23, surmised Isaac, from the information Jeremiah Holt gave him, but she looked older. Life had not been kind. Do you get enough to eat? Isaac asked. She nodded her head, though he was not sure he believed her. Where do you sleep? There's a bed in the kitchen. You don't have your own room? She shook her head. I know what you think, Detective Goldstein, but Uncle Obadiah has given me a safe place to live, and I don't go hungry. My stomach won't let me eat too much. Have you seen a doctor? She shook her head again. I know it may not seem like it to you, she said, but my life changed for the better when Obadiah found me. I'm glad for that, Isaac said. In a more formal manner he said, Do you know why I'm here? She shook her head. Obadiah had a brother, Joshua. You knew him? I knew him when I was a child. Have you seen or heard from him since those days? He came looking for me about 6 years ago. How do you know? I heard that he came to the shelter when I was out. The people there don't tell strangers who is and who isn't living there. Most of the people there don't want to be found. Anyway, by the time I was free to make myself known to him, he was gone. You haven't seen him since? No. I heard that he wanted me to work for him, that he needed my help. What did he want you to do for him, do you know? No, but I have an idea. Go on. Well, when I was a child, Uncle Joshua was the one who taught me to read. I was the first learner, and soon I was showing an interest in what he was reading. But it wasn't English he was reading, but ancient Greek. He taught me to read Greek, and Aramaic, and a little Hebrew. I found it easy to learn. My last memory of him was teaching me Arabic. You think the work he wanted you to do was connected to your ability with languages? I do. What happened? What do you mean? Why did you stop seeing him? Uncle Joshua went to Israel. He had connections there with a man in Jordan. They had worked together before. His colleague discovered something he needed Uncle's help with. Shortly after Joshua left the country, things started to go wrong for us. My mother died, and the man she was living with didn't want me around. I didn't know Uncle Obadiah then, and there was nowhere else to go. The only thing I knew how to do was to translate ancient Greek and Arabic, and there wasn't much call for that in this city. So I did what I had to do in order to survive, and that's where I was till Obadiah found me. Isaac noticed how she passed quickly over her life on the street. Something's happened to Joshua, hasn't it? She said. That's why you're here. Yes, Ruth, I'm afraid he died yesterday. Oh. There were no signs of emotion. Jeremiah Holt is his lawyer, and he wants you to come with your uncle to the reading of the will. I will let your uncle know so that he brings you there. Ruth looked at Isaac while he spoke, but Isaac got the impression she wasn't listening. She was reading Isaac's face. He knew that look. It was a big part of his job, reading people, trying to get at the truth. Well, that's all the questions I have for you now, Ruth. Isaac stood, and Ruth popped up beside him. He felt awkward, open to her. She relaxed her stare, and a sad smile passed across her face. It'll be okay, Isaac, she said.